Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her when she wasn't in the room. Just a nurse with scars on her arms like she'd dragged herself through broken glass. He didn't know that those puckered burns across her forearms came from shrapnel in Baghdad. He didn't know that the scars told a story written in degrees of temperature and force and the kind of pain that teaches you how to be useful. He had no idea who was standing 3 feet away from him in the ICU hallway. The truth was coming. But first, there was a Navy SEAL in room 408 who didn't recognize his own commander officer's mother. The Georgia heat hit Brooke Sullivan like a physical weight the moment she stepped out of her car at 6:02 a.m. Oak Creek Memorial sat 3 blocks from Forsyth Park, a 6-story brick structure that had been healing people since 1981, and in July the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the humidity that turned the hallways sticky and dense. She wore her scrubs the same way she always did, navy blue, fitted at the wrists, sleeves rolled down to her knuckles even when sweat pooled at her collarbone. The exposed skin on her arms would have drawn stares. The scars would have drawn questions. And questions led to conversations, and conversations led to truths she wasn't ready to tell anyone at Oak Creek Memorial. So she kept the sleeves down. She kept her head level. She moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of invisible efficiency that made people forget she was there the moment she left the room. Brooke had been a registered nurse for 18 years. Before that, she'd been something else entirely, something that involved midnight insertions into Anbar province and surgical procedures performed by the light of artillery flashes and the kind of decisiveness that left no room for second-guessing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, embedded with SEAL Team 3 as a special operations medic. 3 combat deployments. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross hanging in a shadow box in the back of her bedroom closet, behind boxes of old photographs she didn't look at anymore. That life had ended 6 years ago in a decision made at 3 a.m. in a studio apartment in San Diego, sitting on the edge of a bed with her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold a coffee cup. She'd walked away. She'd become invisible instead. Her assigned floor was the 4th, cardiac recovery and post-operative monitoring. The kind of work that let her disappear into routine, vital signs every 4 hours, medication administration on schedule, the careful observation that came from understanding that people fell apart in very specific ways if you weren't watching. The morning briefing ran at 7:15, a cluster of 5 nurses and 2 residents standing around the charge nurse's desk while someone read off the census. Brooke listened with the part of her brain that needed to listen. The rest of her was already mapping the floor, indexing the patients, calculating acuity levels the way she used to calculate threat assessment. Room 408 got her attention. Not because the patient was unusual, post-operative Navy officer, admitted yesterday for appendectomy repair, stable vitals on the report, but because his name was listed as Commander Jason Brooks, and Commander Jason Brooks was the man who had given her son Ethan the orders that sent him into the Hindu Kush Mountains for 63 days last spring. She'd never met him. Ethan didn't talk about his commanding officer. But she'd heard the name at the dinner table twice, had heard it in the careful neutral way her son spoke about people he respected. And she knew that Commander Jason Brooks was exactly the kind of operator who would notice that Ethan Sullivan had his mother's steady hands and his mother's way of staying calm when the world was trying to kill him. The floor was already moving by 8 a.m. Breakfast trays, medication passes, a patient in 402 who'd thrown up and needed cleaning, the whole machinery of a hospital waking up and demanding attention. Brooke moved through it all with the same smooth efficiency she'd learned in trauma bays in Fallujah: assess, prioritize, execute, move to the next task. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The kind of competence that made other nurses trust her immediately and doctors forget she was in the room. She got to room 408 at 8:36 a.m. with her vital sign monitor already in hand. The patient was awake, propped on his side to protect the surgical site, watching the ceiling with the flat stare of someone who'd spent the night fighting the fog of post-operative pain medication. Commander Brooks had the kind of face that had seen too much, early 50s, silver threading through dark hair, jaw like a granite outcropping, eyes that tracked her the moment she walked through the door. Military recognition. He knew she moved like someone who'd worn a uniform, even if he didn't know why yet. "Morning, Commander. How's your pain level?" She kept her voice level, professional, the standard timbre of a nurse who'd asked this question 10,000 times. Her hands moved across the monitor's buttons, pulling up his vital signs from the night: heart rate 74, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, temperature 37.2. All exactly where they should be. She'd seen the surgical notes. No complications during the appendectomy. No evidence of infection. A straightforward case that should discharge in 2 days. 5 out of 10, Brooke said. His voice carried the gravel of a man who smoked cigarettes occasionally and gave orders professionally. Better than yesterday. The night nurse was good. That was Jennifer. Brooke reached over and manually checked his radial pulse, reading the watch pinned to her chest, counting the beats. 74. Regular. Strong. She kept her touch professional and her eyes on the monitor. She does good work. She was about to move to the blood pressure cuff when something made her pause. A fraction of a second's hesitation. The kind of micro-observation that years in special operations had trained into her nervous system, the ability to notice when a single variable shifted in an otherwise standard pattern. His breathing. Post-operative patients breathed carefully to protect the surgical site, and that made sense. But Commander Brooks wasn't protecting anything. His respiration was shallow because he was unconsciously limiting it, the way someone did when expansion caused discomfort beyond normal post-operative pain. She placed her stethoscope against his left lung field. Clear. Right side. Still clear. But slightly diminished air entry on the lower portion, and his accessory muscles were working just a fraction harder than they should be. "How's your breathing feeling?" she asked, still neutral, still professional, still nothing in her voice that would alarm him. "Fine." "Why?" "Just checking." She was already running the probability tree in her head. Post-operative appendectomy. Small incision, minimally invasive technique. Low risk for anything serious. But the presentation was textbook early: the shallow breathing, the slightly elevated heart rate underneath the apparent calm, the way his eyes kept checking his chest as if his body was telling him something his brain hadn't processed yet. "You're doing great. Let me get your blood pressure and then you can rest." She worked the cuff with the same steady competence she brought to everything, watching the numbers climb. 128/76. Slightly elevated, but reasonable for post-operative day 1. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. Nothing about Commander Jason Brooks suggested anything other than a straightforward post-operative recovery, and she would have believed it if her hands had developed some kind of sixth sense about human physiology, the kind of sensation that came from being a trauma surgeon without the medical degree, from having learned to read death in the way a person's chest moved or didn't move, from having developed an instinct that was 91% accurate because the 10% when it wasn't accurate usually meant someone didn't make it. "You're doing well," she told him, removing the cuff. "Rest if you can. I'll be back in 4 hours for your next set of vitals." She was heading for the door when Dr. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds. He moved through the hallway like a man who'd been told his entire life that his presence elevated a space, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, shoes polished to a mirror shine, the kind of practiced authority that came from medical school at Johns Hopkins and a family whose name appeared on 3 buildings in Savannah. His eyes passed over her in the doorway with the kind of dismissiveness usually reserved for the janitor or the orderly, someone whose primary function was to exist elsewhere. But then he noticed her arms. The sleeves had ridden up slightly when she was working the vital sign monitor. Just an inch or so of the scarred tissue visible near her wrist, the kind of detail most people wouldn't have registered. Dr. Hargrove's eyes locked onto it like he'd found something fascinating. He looked at the exposed skin with the intensity of a man examining a stain he'd found on his shirt, and something shifted in his expression. Something small and satisfied. "The care team in here doesn't need to be," he paused, searching for the word, "unconventional. Stick to protocol, please." Brooke didn't turn around. She was already moving past him into the hallway, her composure held so carefully you could have cut it with surgical steel. No tremor in her hands. No heat in her voice. just the quiet acknowledgement of a directive followed by immediate compliance. She passed him without a word and continued down the hallway to the medication dispensing station, where she pretended to check a chart while her breathing returned to normal and the part of her that had been trained to survive kept her perfectly, utterly still. Commander Brooks watched her go from his bed in room 408. He hadn't seen her arms, but he'd seen the moment his attending physician had looked at her with contempt. And he'd seen the way she'd responded to it, not with anger or defense, but with a stillness that suggested she'd survived worse than the dismissal of a man in an expensive watch. He'd seen that kind of composure twice in his entire career. Once in himself. Once in the senior enlisted advisor to the commanding general of JSOC, a woman who'd been something extraordinary before becoming invisible. Brooke found the supply closet 7 minutes later and stood in the dark among the boxes of gauze and saline bags and let her shoulders drop for exactly 8 seconds. Then she rolled them back up, checked her reflection in her phone's black screen, and moved back into the hallway like a woman with nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. What she didn't know was that Commander Jason Brooks would be fine for exactly 3 more hours. She didn't know that at 11:54 a.m., something inside his surgical site would shift in a way that would send him toward a crisis that only someone trained in trauma medicine could read coming. She didn't know that the scars on her forearms, the ones Dr. Hargrove had just looked at with such contempt, were the least dangerous thing about her. She didn't know that the Navy SEAL in room 408 was about to become the catalyst for everything. The first thing Mrs. Chen's daughter noticed was the silence. Room 304 had been quiet all morning, the kind of quiet that comes before infection sets in, before sepsis accelerates past the point of return. Brooke Sullivan stood at the bedside, her gloved hand steady on the 4 line, checking the lactate levels on the monitor. 2.8 millimoles per liter. 3 hours ago it was 1.9. The trend was wrong. Everything about Mrs. Chen's presentation was wrong for what Dr. Hargrove had prescribed. Her fever broke this morning, Mrs. Chen's daughter said, relief flooding her voice. The antibiotics are working, right? Brooke didn't answer immediately. She checked the culture results again. E. coli. Gram-negative. Sensitive to ceftriaxone, but Hargrove had ordered cefazolin, a narrow-spectrum agent that wouldn't touch this pathogen effectively. The 2024 Surviving Sepsis guidelines were clear. The evidence was clear. Current standard of care required broad-spectrum coverage until culture specificity was confirmed. Not this. Not cefazolin. Dr. Hargrove was entering the room, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped like a status symbol across his shoulders. He moved with the kind of practiced confidence that came from never being questioned, from 30 years of a career where people nodded and deferred and didn't contradict him in front of families. Brooke took a measured breath. Not because she was afraid. Because she had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth quietly. Dr. Hargrove, she said, her voice level and professional, the lactate is trending upward. Mrs. Chen's culture grew E. coli, gram-negative. Cefazolin won't cover that spectrum effectively. Current sepsis protocol recommends switching to ceftriaxone or piperacillin-tazobactam pending sensitivity confirmation. The room went still. Mrs. Chen's daughter held her breath. Hargrove's face flushed, not red but a darker shade, like someone had turned up the heat beneath his skin. He stared at Brooke for a long moment, and in that moment she understood exactly what she had done. Nurse Sullivan, he said, his voice dropping to a tone that suggested she had committed a profound transgression, step outside. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Hargrove pulled the door closed behind them with controlled precision, and when he spoke, his voice was no louder than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a threat. You do not contradict me in front of families. Ever. You do not second-guess my clinical judgment. You follow orders. That is your role. Brooke kept her eyes forward. The evidence. I don't care about your evidence. I care about hierarchy. His jaw tightened. There are protocols, Nurse Sullivan. And you violated them. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the rhythm of finality. Brooke stood alone in the hallway, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, and did not allow herself to feel anything at all. That afternoon, she saw her own name on the unit board. The write-up was printed in black ink, visible to every nurse, doctor, and visitor who passed the break room. It was positioned above the staffing schedule, a public monument to professional failure. B. Sullivan, staff violation. Unprofessional appearance, undermining physician authority. Patient-family complaints regarding nurse presentation and demeanor. Visible scarring inconsistent with professional healthcare standards. Violation of chain of command protocols. Recommend retraining on scope of practice boundaries. The word sat there like an accusation. Not about her clinical judgment. Not about the fact that she had been right about the lactate, right about the sepsis protocol, right about Mrs. Chen's deteriorating status. The violation was about her scars. About the way she looked. About the fact that she had dared to speak. Brooke read it once, committed every word to memory, and walked past it without changing her expression. Pain was data. Humiliation was information. She had learned both lessons in places where the cost of showing weakness was measured in lives. The next morning in the break room, she pulled her lunch from the refrigerator and sat at the small table by the window. Jennifer, Marcus, and Susan were gathering their trays at the counter. Brooke watched them as she unwrapped her sandwich. She watched Jennifer glance at Marcus. She watched Susan whisper something that made all three of them look away. They gathered their lunches and moved to a table on the opposite side of the room. Not dramatically. Not with any obvious cruelty. Just a quiet, coordinated retreat that said, "We're not sitting with her. Nobody sits with her anymore." Brooke took one measured breath. She unwrapped her sandwich with steady hands. The bread was soft against her fingers. She ate slowly, methodically, the way she had learned to eat in places where you never knew when the next meal would come. She did not look at the other table. She did not acknowledge their existence. She simply existed in the space she occupied and took sustenance from it, the same way she had taken sustenance from harder things. Susan whispered something else. A muffled laugh followed. Brooke finished her sandwich. She drank her water. She cleaned up her trash. And when she stood to leave, she walked past the other table with her head level, her shoulders back, and her scarred forearms uncovered. Let them see. Let them stare. She had survived worse than their contempt. She had survived things that would have broken the women at that table into pieces too small to reassemble. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:53 p.m. when she was checking on Mrs. Chen in room 304. The patient's daughter was standing in the hallway, speaking with Hargrove. Their voices carried through the partially open door, not loud, but audible in that specific way that meant they weren't trying to be private. "Doctor, could I ask you something?" Mrs. Chen's daughter said. "Of course. My mother mentioned it yesterday, but I didn't want to make a fuss. She said she'd prefer a different nurse. One who looks more professional. Those scars make her uncomfortable. Is that something you could arrange?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Of course, Mrs. Chen," Hargrove said, and Brooke heard his smile in his voice. "Absolutely. We want your mother to be as comfortable as possible. Nurse Sullivan, you're reassigned to post-op recovery. Rebecca from the day shift will take over Mrs. Chen's care." Brooke was still in the room. Mrs. Chen was looking at her with an expression somewhere between apologetic and resolved, the expression of someone who had made a request and received immediate satisfaction. The elderly woman's granddaughter had been in and out all morning, and apparently Mrs. Chen had communicated her discomfort about the scarred nurse very clearly. Brooke felt one tear escape. Just one. She felt it roll down her cheek like a drop of rain on a windshield, and she did not wipe it away immediately. She stood there for 2 seconds and let Hargrove see it. Let him see that he had landed something. That this had cost her something. Then she washed her scarred hand and wiped the tear with the back of her wrist, and when she looked up, she held Hargrove's gaze with perfect, terrible calm. "I've survived worse than you, doctor." 7 words. That's all it took. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had been forged in places where survival meant something very different from what Hargrove would ever understand. She turned and walked toward the supply closet at the end of the hallway. Closed the door behind her. Stood in the darkness between the stacks of gauze and saline and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds. Her breathing stayed controlled. Her hands did not shake. She simply stood there in the dark and let the weight of it settle, and when 30 seconds had passed, she opened the door and returned to work. Post-op recovery needed vital signs checked on 4 patients. She moved through the rooms with the same precision she had maintained all morning, for lines inspected, dressings changed, medication times documented. Her face was neutral. Her voice was professional. Her hands were steady. But something had shifted. Something in the way she moved, something in the set of her shoulders. The nurses who passed her in the hallway noticed it, though they couldn't have articulated what they noticed. It was like watching someone remove a mask so incrementally that you didn't notice the moment it came off, only that the face underneath looked different. When her shift ended at 3:08 p.m., Brooke walked to the parking lot. The Georgia summer heat hit her like a fist. 94 degrees. Humidity so thick it felt like drowning in air. She got into her 2011 Honda CR-V, 12 years old, 147,000 miles, every ding and scratch a record of invisible journeys, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The combat boots were in the trunk. She had placed them there 8 years ago when she first started nursing at Oak Creek Memorial, the day she decided she couldn't carry them with her anymore but couldn't quite bring herself to throw them away. Size 9. Desert tan. The leather cracked in 3 places. One sole was separating from the heel. The insoles still bore faint impressions from the arches of feet that had walked through Ramadi and Fallujah, through places where the sand was red in a way that had nothing to do with geology. She sat in the parked car and thought about those boots. Thought about the weight they carried. Thought about the fact that no matter how far you ran from who you were, there would always be something in your trunk that reminded you. Brooke started the engine and drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The air conditioning cycled on and off. Mile markers passed. Traffic lights shifted from red to green to red again. She drove through Savannah with the precision of someone navigating terrain they had already mapped 1,000 times, and when she finally pulled into the driveway of the small cottage she shared with her 15-year-old son, the sun was bleeding orange across the horizon. Ethan wasn't home yet. He wouldn't be home until 5, after football practice, after stopping at his friend Marcus's house. She had 4 hours alone, and she used those 4 hours the way she had learned to use all her alone time. She changed out of her scrubs, she showered, she looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 7 seconds without flinching, and she prepared her face for the version of herself her son needed her to be. By the time she heard his key in the lock, she was standing at the kitchen counter, hand steady, smile in place, nothing visible on her face but the mask of a mother who had simply had a long shift. What none of them knew, not Mrs. Chen, not Dr. Hargrove, not the 3 nurses gathered at the other table, was that in room 408, a Navy SEAL named Commander Jason Brooks was recovering from his surgery, and during Brooks' shift that morning, while she was being reassigned and dismissed and reduced to her scars, he had seen something in her eyes. Something in the way she moved. Something that had triggered a recognition he couldn't quite place. He had served with Ethan Sullivan for 4 years. He had attended his operator's home twice. He had met Ethan's mother exactly once, 8 years ago, at a change of command ceremony in Virginia Beach, and she had been in dress uniform that day, standing at attention beside a general's wife, utterly unremarkable. But the nurse in room 304. The nurse with the scarred forearms and the quiet voice and the way she held a vital check like it was a sacrament. Something about her made the back of his neck prickle the way it only prickled around people who had actually seen combat. People who had actually been tested at the boundaries where survival stopped being theoretical. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what had transpired in that hallway outside his door. But he had heard every word. And something in his chest, something trained by years of reading tactical situations, knew that the quiet nurse with the scars had just become the most dangerous person in that hospital. He was right. He just didn't know how right yet. 2 in the morning felt different at Oak Creek Memorial. The fluorescent lights hummed with a different frequency after midnight, and the hallways moved at the pace of held breath rather than urgency. Brooke Sullivan made her rounds with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned long ago that good nursing happened in the spaces between emergencies. Room 408 was her last check before the shift settled into its deepest quiet. Commander Jason Brooks lay in the semi-darkness, his chest rising and falling with the measured rhythm of post-operative recovery. Day 3 after shoulder reconstruction. Everything should have been textbook. Instead, Brooks' eyes caught what the monitors were just beginning to whisper, his respiratory rate climbing from 18 to 22 breaths per minute. Small. Nearly invisible. But not to someone who'd spent 3 combat deployments reading the body's earliest warnings. She approached the bed without sound. Her stethoscope found his lungs first, good air movement bilaterally, no crackles. She'd learned to trust stethoscopes more than the machine sometimes, had learned to listen to what the body was actually saying beneath the electronic reassurance. Brooks' eyes were closed, but she felt his awareness shift as she worked. The trained stillness of a seal who'd learned to sense presence even in sleep. Her fingers found his neck, palpating gently. There. A subtle deviation. His trachea had shifted perhaps half an inch to the left, barely enough to notice unless you were looking for it. Unless you'd seen it before. Unless you'd watched a man's airway collapse under pressure and knew what the body did in the seconds before it failed. How is he? The voice came from behind her, thin and papery like old cigarette smoke. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his white coat pristine at 2 in the morning, which meant he hadn't been here all night. He'd come back for something. Or someone. Respiratory rate elevated. Brooks' voice stayed level, professional, the kind of voice that asked for nothing. 22. Baseline was 16. Slight tracheal deviation, left side. O2 sat holding at 94 on room air. Hargrove waved his hand dismissively. The gesture made the hospital badge clatter against his ribs. Post-operative day 3. Discomfort causes tachypnea. The deviation is positioning. He's lying on his surgical side. He pulled the chart from the wall mount without looking at it. I want you documenting less frequently. You're creating alarm where there is none. Every 15 minutes, Nurse Sullivan? That borders on obsessive. His baseline vitals were stable until tonight, Brooke said quietly. Not a challenge. Not a plea. A fact. And they remain acceptable. This is exactly the kind of overreaction that clouds clinical judgment. Hargrove's eyes found her scarred forearms, exposed because the night shift ran hot and she'd rolled her sleeves up during the earlier emergency on the floor below. His expression shifted, not to concern, but to something colder. Calculation. You know, I've been thinking about that incident in the break room. The nursing staff leaving when you sat down. Do you know why that happens? Brooke said nothing. Silence was its own kind of answer, and she'd learned to let her opponents fill it. It's because credibility matters, Sullivan. Professionalism matters. And frankly, people don't trust nurses who look like they've made poor life choices. He gestured vaguely at her arms. Those scars. What do you expect patients to think? That you survived something dangerous and chaotic. That you might bring that instability into their care. She met his eyes. Held them. No tremor in her jaw. No heat rising through her chest. Just the cold clarity that came from having survived things that would have broken most people. The kind of calm that comes from already knowing the worst. I'll continue documenting his vitals as they change, she said. 10 words. Exactly what she needed. No more. Hargrove's face tightened. He wasn't used to being ignored. You'll document on my schedule or you'll document yourself out of a job. Is that clear enough, or should I find smaller words? He left before she could answer, the door hissing shut behind him. Brooke turned back to Brooks, who was now watching her with eyes that had seen things. Eyes that understood the language of survival. Rest, she told him. I'm monitoring close. She didn't say she'd disobey direct orders to do it. She didn't say that she'd already seen the patterns in his labs and his symptoms and the way his body was screaming without making any sound. She said nothing at all, which meant everything. Over the next 4 hours, Brooke continued her vigilant monitoring during her official breaks and the gaps between assigned rounds. By dawn, Brooke's respiratory rate had settled back to 20, his oxygen saturation holding at 95%. She documented everything in meticulous detail, every number recorded, every observation timestamped. The kind of documentation that would hold up in a courtroom. The kind of nursing that assumed someone would eventually need proof. By 8 in the morning, she understood what Hargrove had done. Her name appeared on the assignment board with a reassignment. Surgical floor. All lower acuity patients. Post-operative day 5 and beyond, minimal monitoring requirements. Brooke's name had been reassigned to a junior nurse, Stephanie, fresh out of orientation, competent but not yet fluent in the language of complications. Brooke finished her charting in silence. She could have spoken. Could have raised her voice or filed a complaint or called the union rep whose number she'd memorized her first week. Instead, she watched Hargrove make a phone call from his office, watched him close the door, watched his mouth move in words she couldn't hear but understood perfectly. The call lasted 17 minutes. By the afternoon, she noticed 2 changes. The first was the arrival of an investigator in pressed slacks and a blazer that screamed State Medical Board. The woman's name was Dr. Patricia Klein, and she spent 40 minutes with Hargrove behind closed doors. The second was the appearance of a carefully worded memo in everyone's mailbox, a reminder about scope of practice limitations for RNS, about the dangers of overstepping, about how good intention sometimes led to liability. It was addressed to no one specifically. It was addressed to everyone. Brooke was stocking the surgical floor supply cart when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Ms. Sullivan? This is Dr. Richard Halverson from University Medical Center. Dr. Hargrove provided your name as a reference. I have a few questions about your employment history. The voice was official, clinical, the kind of voice that had already made its decision. Specifically, we're concerned about several gaps in your work history. Were you terminated from your previous positions, or did you leave voluntarily? She could hear papers rustling. Could hear the intonation of someone reading from a script that had already been written for her. Family circumstances, she said simply. I took time off. All of it approved by my employers. Approved leaves of absence are typically noted in employment records, the voice continued. Your file shows unexplained gaps. Months at a time. Can you clarify the nature of your absence during the summer of 2018? Her hand stilled on the 4 bags she was organizing. Summer of 2018. She knew exactly what had happened that summer. What she'd been doing. Whom she'd been saving. But that information wasn't in any file, wasn't available for a casual background check, wasn't something a civilian employment verification service could access. I can provide personal references, she said quietly. People who know my work firsthand. We've already contacted 3 of your previous supervisors, Dr. Halverson said. 2 did not return our calls. 1 stated she couldn't speak about the circumstances of your departure. The phone call ended 3 minutes later. By the time she'd finished organizing the supply cart, Brooke understood what was happening. Hargrove wasn't just trying to remove her from Brooke's care anymore. He was building a case. He was activating connections, medical school roommates, ethics committees, state investigators, like dominoes that had been prepositioned years ago. It took her 20 minutes to find the memo that had been quietly posted in Hargrove's office directory, a memo she could see through the partially open glass door, a request for scope of practice review, submitted by the hospital's ethics committee, citing concerns about independent clinical decision-making by nursing staff, particularly in high-acuity patients. The memo was addressed to a state medical board investigator. The name at the top was Dr. Joel Pemberton, who Brooke had learned through a quick search was Hargrove's medical school roommate. Class of 1998. Yale University. By 4 o'clock, the assignment board had changed again. Every complex case, every patient with potential for deterioration, had been reassigned away from Brooke. She was left with post-op day 7 patients, uncomplicated recoveries, cases that required basic observation and wound care. She'd been benched. Quietly. Efficiently. Without a single word of explanation or confrontation. She was restocking the surgical floor again at 4:47 p.m. when she saw it through the windows of room 408 on the floor below. A junior nurse was checking Brooke's vitals. Competent motions. Routine assessment. No depth. No reading of the subtle language that said his body was still deteriorating. His respiratory rate was 26 now. She could see his chest rise and fall even from her vantage point 3 stories up. His neck was visibly tense, his shoulders hunched toward his ears in that posture of guarded breathing. She could walk away. Could accept the reassignment and the quiet removal from his care and the message that had been sent in 17 minutes behind a closed office door. Could let the investigation proceed and assume someone else would catch what she'd seen. Or she could make a choice that would make the situation irreversible. She made the choice while peeling off her outer gloves, while clipping her badge to her fresh scrubs, while taking the stairs down instead of the elevator because they were faster and quieter and nobody used them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Dr. Hargrove was still on the floor. Still present. Still positioned to ensure that whatever happened next, whatever happened in room 408, would be exactly what he wanted. Room 408. 2:14 p.m. Commander Brooke's monitors suddenly shifted from their steady rhythm into something else entirely. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical pulse, constant and reliable, until it wasn't. Brooke was 2 rooms down when she heard it, not an alarm yet, but that particular quality of silence that comes before the machine realizes something has gone wrong. The absence of beeping. The pause before the panic. She moved without thinking, the way muscle memory moves when the brain hasn't caught up yet. Her feet carried her toward the sound before her conscious mind had finished the calculation. 23 years of medicine. 3 combat deployments. 14 wounded under mortar fire. The body knows what the mind is still learning. Brooke's trachea had shifted. Visibly. To the right. His chest rose and fell, but the air wasn't moving through, it was moving into the space between his lung and chest wall. A pocket of pressure, invisible and lethal, collapsing his right lung like a fist closing around tissue paper. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of emergency that kills in minutes if nobody acts. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 88. 82, each number a second bleeding away. His face had taken on that particular shade of grey that means the body is already calculating its own death. His eyes were wide, mouth open, trying to pull air through lungs that had nowhere left to expand. The gasping of a man drowning in his own chest cavity. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway. Clipboard slack in his hand. Mouth slightly open. The look of a man watching something he doesn't understand and doesn't know how to fix. The kind of freeze that comes from being trained for theory but never for urgency. Brooke didn't freeze. Didn't hesitate. Didn't call for the code team or wait for physician authorization or follow the chain of command that existed in a world where things moved slowly enough for hierarchy to matter. This wasn't that world anymore. This was Ramadi. This was the moment before the moment everything changed. She grabbed the crash cart. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone who'd done this before under conditions that made a hospital emergency room look like a vacation. The 14-gauge needle was in her fingers before she'd consciously decided to pick it up. The alcohol swab came next. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmark burned into muscle memory so deeply it had become part of her skeleton. 40 seconds. That was the window. 40 seconds before his oxygen saturation dropped below 60 and his heart started to follow. 40 seconds before brain damage became irreversible. She swabbed his chest. Didn't ask permission. Didn't explain. Didn't hesitate. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, sliding between the ribs the way she'd learned in a trauma surgery course in 2004 that had taught her how to use a patient's own body as a map. The needle found the air pocket. The hiss of decompression filled the room, that sound like a tire letting out, except it was a man's chest wall releasing the pressure that had been killing him. Air escaped. The needle hissed like something alive coming back to life. His oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, his chest heaved once, a real breath, air moving the way air was supposed to move, filling lungs instead of the space around them. 91, 95. Breathing. Stable. His eyes locked onto hers. That moment stretched. His gaze dropped from her face to her arm where the sleeve had rolled up during the procedure. The Navy SEAL trident tattoo was fully visible, identical to the one on his own chest beneath the hospital gown. 3 points. The symbol that meant you'd been forged in water and fire and impossible decisions. The symbol that meant you belonged to something that didn't forget its own. His lips formed a silent question. A name maybe. A realization maybe. But the code team was already moving through the door, the trained choreography of emergency medicine taking over, and Brooke stepped back into the shadows where she'd been standing her entire career. By the time the monitors stabilized and Brooke's vital signs climbed back to baseline, she was already removing her gloves. The code team leader, a woman named Chen who'd been at Oak Creek for 7 years, looked at Brooke with that particular expression of someone trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. The way you look at something that doesn't make sense because it shouldn't be possible. How did you? Chen started. The intercom crackled. Dr. Hargrove's voice, tight and controlled, and something else underneath the control. Something that sounded like rage. Nurse Sullivan. Step outside. Now. Brooke didn't acknowledge him. She charted the intervention. Time of needle decompression. Site. Result. Patient response. 2:14 p.m. Right second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Immediate improvement in oxygenation and hemodynamics. O2 saturation climbed from 78 to 95 within 30 seconds of decompression. Patient breathing spontaneously. Hargrove was already in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, walking toward the stairwell with the kind of velocity that meant he was having a conversation he didn't want anyone to hear. His voice carried anyway because he wasn't trying to hide it anymore. Wasn't pretending to be reasonable. The mask had slipped. Gerald, it's Hargrove. She just performed an invasive procedure without authorization. On my patient. In my hospital. A pause. His voice dropped lower but didn't get quieter. I don't care about her credentials. I want her badge. I want the state board investigator here within the hour. And I want her escorted out of this building before anyone finds out what she did without a physician present. This ends today. Brooke finished her charting. Closed the computer. Took her hands out of Brooke's room the way she'd learned, competent, precise, invisible. The way you move when you understand that some lines, once crossed, don't allow for hesitation or second thoughts. Within 2 hours, security was at her locker. 2 uniformed men with the careful professionalism of people who'd done this before and would do it again. One of them held a printed document. A suspension notice. Pending investigation. Scope of practice review. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Insubordination. You can take your personal items, the security officer said. Not unkind. Just professional. You're not authorized to access the unit anymore. Brooke gathered her things. The stethoscope her son had given her 5 years ago. The hand lotion that kept her fingers from cracking in winter. A photo of Ethan at his 8th grade graduation, still young enough to smile at a camera without the weight of knowing his mother had secrets that could reshape his life. The pair of worn combat boots sat in her locker. The one she'd carried out of Baghdad the day she decided she couldn't do it anymore. The one she kept in her car the way other people kept spare tire supplies or jumper cables. Just in case. The weight of those boots had never felt light, but now it felt impossible, like they'd been packed with something denser than leather and memory. She drove home in silence. The radio off. The windows down. The Savannah heat pressing against her skin like something alive and oppressive. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes took 40 because she couldn't make herself drive faster than deliberate. Couldn't make herself do anything but move forward at the speed of someone who understood that everything had just changed. Ethan found her at the kitchen table. 20 minutes after she'd walked through the door. Still in her scrubs. Still wearing the hospital badge that no longer meant anything. The tears had started somewhere between the parking lot and the first red light, the kind of tears that come from somewhere so deep you don't feel them leaving, you just feel the absence afterward. Mom? Why are you home? What happened? She couldn't answer him. Couldn't find the words that would bridge the gap between who he thought she was and who she actually was. The woman who held his hand at baseball games. The woman who made his lunch every morning. The woman who'd learned to smile through 30 years of carrying a secret that heavy. She'd buried the PTSD under 6 years of quiet nursing shifts. Under the rhythm of caring for people who needed her. Under the weight of pretending that her scars were just scars and her past was just the past and she could exist in both worlds at the same time. That you could be a mother and a soldier simultaneously. That you could save lives in peacetime the same way you'd saved lives when the world was ending. The PTSD had other ideas. It clawed its way back to the surface like something that had been drowning and finally found air. The fluorescent lights of the hospital had suddenly become searchlights. The monitors had become the sound of helicopter rotors. The hallway had become a corridor in a forward operating base where every shadow held the weight of decisions made and lives balanced on the edge of needles. She'd performed that decompression the way she'd been trained. Clean. Efficient. Correct. The way you perform surgery when there's no time for fear or second guessing. The way you move when you understand that hesitation means death. And in saving Commander Brooks, she'd revealed the one thing she'd spent 6 years hiding. Mom. Ethan sat down beside her. 15 years old and already developing the kind of posture that suggested he'd inherited something from her besides her eyes. Talk to me. She just shook her head. The words would come later. The explanations. The apologies. The understanding that everything was about to change in ways neither of them could predict yet. But not now. Now there was only the weight of combat boots in a truck. The weight of a trident tattoo on an arm. The weight of a secret that had finally stopped being secret. The weight of a choice made in 40 seconds that was going to reshape every day that came after it. 3 days passed like a held breath. Brooke sat in her apartment, the worn combat boot still in the trunk of her car, and waited for the summons she knew would come. It arrived typed on hospital letterhead, disciplinary hearing, conference room B, 10 a.m. sharp. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why she'd exceeded her scope of practice. They wanted to know why she'd touched a patient without physician authorization. They wanted to know why a nurse, a temporary, fragile nurse with scars on her forearms, had dared to think she could save a life. The morning of the hearing, Brooke stood in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial and pulled her sleeves down one final time. The early September heat was already brutal, pressing down on Savannah like a thumb. She could feel the weight of the trident tattoo beneath the cotton, still a secret, still hidden. She straightened her shoulders and walked through the automatic doors. The conference room was exactly as she'd imagined it, cold, sterile, designed to make you feel small. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of a polished oak table, his pressed suit immaculate, his smile the kind of smile that belongs to men who've never had to apologize for anything. On either side of him sat 2 board members in matching neutral expressions. At the far end of the table sat Gerald Pemberton, ethics committee chairman and Hargrove's medical school roommate, his pen poised over a legal pad. Brooke took the chair across from them. Alone. The first question came from Pemberton, his voice smooth as oil. Senior Chief, he paused, catching himself, correcting to Ms. Sullivan, you understand why you're here. You performed a medical procedure without physician oversight. A procedure that, while it happened to save the patient's life, falls outside the scope of nursing practice in this state. What do you have to say for yourself?" She opened her mouth to respond. The doors burst open. Ethan stood in the threshold, 17 years old, carrying something that made the room's oxygen seem to thin. A shadow box. Inside it, 3 decorations hung on a field of blue fabric. The Navy Cross gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The bronze star with veiler caught the light like it was demanding attention. The purple heart sat beneath them both, humble and lethal. Ethan's voice didn't shake. It carried the same calm precision as hers. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, and you need to see these." The pen fell from Pemberton's hand. Dr. Hargrove's face went the color of old newspaper. The doors opened again. Commander Jason Brooks appeared in the frame, still moving slowly, his footpole rolling beside him like a chrome sentinel. He wore his uniform, crisp dress blues with the SEAL's insignia stark against his chest. He carried a manila folder, and his hands trembled as he opened it. Not from weakness. From rage. 3 combat deployments, Brooks said, his voice the texture of gravel and authority. Special Operations Medic, embedded with SEAL Team 3. Iraq, 2003 to 2007. He turned the page. Emergency Battlefield Surgery Under Fire in Ramadi. August 2004. Another page. Second Battle of Fallujah. 14 lives saved. 14 men who walked out of the hospital because she didn't wait for permission. Brooks looked up, and his eyes locked on Dr. Hargrove's. 14 operators alive right now because a nurse decided that following protocol was less important than keeping people breathing. The doors opened a third time. A man in a dress uniform entered, SEAL Team 3 commander, flown in from Virginia Beach, the kind of presence that made the walls seem to shrink. He didn't sit. He stood at parade rest and began to speak, his voice carrying through the room with the weight of official record. Bronze star with veiler. Pause. The room absorbed the weight. Silver star. Another pause. Longer. Purple heart. And then purple heart again. And finally, the one that made Pemberton stand up, Navy Cross. Dr. Hargrove's face had stopped being a face. It was just a collection of features collapsing inward. This woman, the commander said, is a decorated veteran of the United States Navy. Everything she did in that hospital room, every second of it, was muscle memory. It was training. It was the same training she gave to Commander Brooks when he was a junior enlisted medic in her unit. He turned to face Hargrove directly. "You tried to fire a Navy SEAL for saving the life of another Navy SEAL. And then you tried to erase the evidence." The IT director stepped forward. Rodriguez. Mid-40s, Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, the kind of calm that comes from having done difficult things. He opened his laptop and projected the security footage onto the conference room screen. There was Brooke, 40 seconds of pure competence. The 14-gauge needle sliding into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping the pleural cavity. The immediate rise of oxygen saturation on the monitor, 68 to 75 to 82 to 88 to 94. Her movements like someone conducting an orchestra that only she could hear. And there was Hargrove, frozen in the doorway, his hands at his sides, watching a nurse do the job he couldn't do. Dr. Hargrove requested I delete this footage, Rodriguez said quietly. I have the timestamp on the request. For 3:33 p.m. yesterday. I preserved every frame and reported the tampering attempt to the State Medical Board 1 hour later. The Ethics Committee Chair, Pemberton, Hargrove's friend since medical school, closed the folder in front of him and stood. Gerald, I can't be part of this. I won't be. The hospital administrator leaned forward. Your credentials are suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will escort you to your office. But there was more. There was always more. A nurse stepped forward from the back of the room where she'd been standing unnoticed. Marcus. One of the three who'd left the break room when Brooke sat down. Dr. Hargrove told us Senior Chief Sullivan was unstable. He said she was being investigated for patient endangerment. He told us we should document any interaction with her. He told us. Marcus's voice hardened. He lied to us. To all of us. Hargrove tried to stand. His voice came out thin, desperate. This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting the hospital from liability. She's a nurse, not a physician, Anne. You tried to destroy a decorated war hero because she knew more than you. Commander Brooks cut him off like a blade. Because when you froze, she moved. And you couldn't forgive that. Security escorts Hargrove out. His hospital privileges are suspended. The State Medical Board investigation will take 6 months, and at the end of those 6 months, his medical license will be formally suspended for ethics violations and evidence tampering. He'll end up teaching CPR fundamentals to Board Community College students for $13 an hour, reading from a manual he doesn't understand to people who aren't listening, a man who once commanded respect and lost it all in 40 seconds. But that's 6 months away. Right now, in the conference room, Brooke stands slowly. Her sleeves are still down. She hasn't moved them. Hasn't shown the tattoo to anyone. Doesn't need to. Ethan walks to her side. The commander nods. The SEAL team commander steps forward and extends his hand. Senior Chief, welcome home. Brooke takes it. Her grip is steady. 6 months later, a hospital photographer stands in the hallway at Oak Creek Memorial, the same hallway where security once escorted Brooke out, and captures a moment that goes viral across social media before noon. Commander Jason Brooke stands at attention in his dress blues, his body straight as a blade, his right hand raised in a formal salute. Facing him is Brooke Sullivan in fresh scrubs, sleeves rolled up, the Navy SEAL trident tattoo visible on her scarred forearm, her right hand raised in return. Behind them, staff members line both sides of the corridor. Marcus. Jennifer. Susan. Mrs. Chen, who sent a handwritten apology letter weeks ago. Ethan stands beside his mother in school clothes, beaming with the kind of pride that only comes from seeing the world finally see what you've always known. The worn combat boots no longer sit in the trunk of Brooke's car. They're displayed in the hospital's lobby now, mounted in a glass case beside her decorations, the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, both Purple Hearts, part of a permanent memorial honoring veteran healthcare workers. The placard reads, "Those who serve in silence often carry the heaviest loads." Oak Creek Memorial has created the Sullivan Combat Medicine Fellowship, a 12-week intensive training program teaching nurses the same battlefield trauma techniques that saved Commander Brooks's life. Brooke runs it. She teaches 47 nurses in the first cohort how to perform needle decompression for tension pneumothorax, how to recognize the early warning signs Hargrove missed, how to trust their instincts when institutional authority gets it wrong. In the trauma simulation lab, she stands with her hands behind her back, watching a third-year nursing student practice the procedure on a high-fidelity mannequin. The student hesitates. Questions herself. Brooke speaks quietly, "You already know the answer. Your hands know what to do. Let them." The needle goes in. Air hisses out. The mannequin's oxygen saturation climbs. The student looks up, and Brooke nods. That's how you save a life. That's how you do it when no one's watching, and that's how you do it when they all are. Same technique. Same commitment. The only difference is whether you're brave enough to be yourself. The student nods and tries again. In a classroom at Savannah Community College, Dr. Hargrove stands in front of 15 uninterested students, reading CPR technique from a laminated manual. He makes $13 an hour. He teaches on Monday and Wednesday nights. He hasn't been invited to any hospital grand rounds in 6 months. His golf club membership was quietly cancelled. The medical school reunion invitation that arrived last month had a note attached, "We're not sure that's a good fit this year." The tattoo on Brooke's forearm has stopped being a secret. It's become a symbol. Whenever new nurses are admitted to the fellowship, the first thing they learn is the story, the real story, not the hospital version, but the actual thing that happened. A decorated war hero hired as an invisible nurse. A jealous physician. An emergency that demanded everything. A 40-second sequence of actions that cost Dr. Hargrove his career and gave Brooke her voice back. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've ever been underestimated by someone with authority, if you've ever been judged on your appearance rather than your competence, if you've ever felt invisible despite carrying invisible decorations, you need to see this story. Share it. Because the people who survive the worst often become the ones who give the most. And the world needs to know their names. Subscribe for more stories of the quiet heroes who change everything when the moment demands it.